The rain hammered against the windshield of Marcus Rivera's beat-up Ford pickup as he pulled into the 24-hour diner on Route 47. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the crumpled $5 bill in his shirt pocket, the last of his money until his next paycheck from Rodriguez Auto Repair. His 8-year-old son Danny was at home, hopefully still asleep, unaware that their electricity had been shut off 3 hours ago. Marcus had been driving around for the past hour trying to figure out how to stretch $5 into a miracle. Gas for the truck to get to work tomorrow, or food for Danny's lunchbox. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The choice shouldn't have been this hard for a man with 15 years of automotive experience under his belt. But life had a way of reducing even the most skilled mechanics to impossible decisions. The diner's neon sign flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the empty parking lot. Through the rain-streaked windows, Marcus could see the usual cast of night shift workers, truck drivers, and insomniacs nursing their coffee and avoiding eye contact. This wasn't exactly the kind of place where miracles happened, but it was warm, dry, and the coffee was cheap enough that his $5 might buy him a few hours of shelter while he figured out his next move. As he pushed through the heavy glass door, the familiar smell of grease and burnt coffee enveloped him. The hostess, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes, waved him toward any open booth. Marcus chose one near the back, away from the main flow of traffic, and slumped into the worn vinyl seat. The menu prices stared back at him mockingly. Even the cheapest cup of coffee would leave him with barely enough for gas. The bell above the diner door chimed again, but this time it was followed by a commotion that made every head in the place turn. A woman in an expensive-looking business suit stumbled through the entrance, her usually perfect appearance completely disheveled. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her designer heels clicked unsteadily against the linoleum floor. She clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid, and her skin had taken on an alarming grayish pallor. Victoria Sterling had been driving back from the quarterly board meeting when the chest pains started. At first, she dismissed them as stress. The presentation hadn't gone as smoothly as planned, and the board members had asked pointed questions about the company's new environmental initiatives. But as the pain intensified and spread down her left arm, even her stubborn pride couldn't ignore the obvious signs. She'd pulled off the highway at the first exit, her BMW's GPS leading her to this modest diner in the middle of nowhere. The other patrons watched with the detached curiosity of people who'd seen their share of late-night drama, but none moved to help. The hostess looked concerned, but seemed unsure whether to approach. Victoria's legs gave out, and she grabbed onto the nearest booth for support, her expensive purse clattering to the floor and spilling its contents across the checkered tiles. Marcus didn't hesitate, his own problems forgotten. He was out of his seat and at her side before her knees hit the ground. Years of working in an environment where quick reflexes could mean the difference between a minor cut and a severed finger had trained him to act first and think second when someone was in trouble. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His voice was steady, calm, despite the obvious urgency of the situation. He guided her gently to the nearest booth, his work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit down. "Just try to breathe slowly, in and out." Victoria looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Even in her distressed state, she couldn't help but notice the genuine concern in his face, the way his calloused hands moved with careful precision as he helped her settle into the booth. This wasn't the kind of man she usually encountered in her corporate world. No expensive suit, no calculated charm, just honest worry for a stranger in trouble. I think I'm having a heart attack," she managed to whisper between labored breaths. The admission felt surreal. Victoria Sterling, who had climbed to the top of Sterling Petroleum through sheer determination and strategic brilliance, reduced to a frightened woman in a roadside diner, dependent on the kindness of strangers. Marcus's expression grew more serious, but his voice remained reassuringly calm. "We need to get you to a hospital right away. Where's your phone? We should call 911. Victoria's hands shook as she gestured weakly toward her spilled purse. "Battery died hours ago. I was supposed to charge it in the car, but," she trailed off, the irony not lost on her that all her wealth and influence meant nothing when faced with a dead phone battery and a potentially failing heart. The diner's ancient payphone in the corner caught Marcus's attention, but he knew it would cost quarters he didn't have. His truck's radio could reach emergency services, but not from inside the building. Every second counted in situations like this, and the nearest hospital was at least 20 minutes away under ideal conditions. In this weather, with these roads, it could take much longer. "Listen," Marcus said, his mind racing through options. "My truck's right outside. I can drive you to County General faster than waiting for an ambulance in this storm. It's not pretty, but it runs good, and I know these roads better than any GPS." Victoria studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. In her world, every offer came with strings attached, every kindness had a price tag. But something in Marcus's eyes, a straightforward honesty she rarely encountered, made the decision for her. She nodded weakly, not trusting her voice. Marcus carefully helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way toward the door. The other diners watched their progress with mild interest, but none offered assistance. The hostess called out something about being careful, but her words were lost in the sound of rain against the windows. The storm had intensified while they'd been inside. Rain fell in sheets, turning the parking lot into a series of interconnected puddles. Marcus's truck looked even more battered in the harsh glare of the diner's exterior lights, rust spots, a mismatched passenger door from a junkyard replacement, and a crack across the windshield that he'd been meaning to fix for months. "It's not much to look at," Marcus said apologetically as he helped Victoria toward the passenger side, "but she's reliable where it counts." Victoria didn't care about the truck's appearance. Her chest felt like someone was sitting on it, and each breath required conscious effort. She was beyond worrying about her reputation or what her board members would think, if they could see her now, climbing into a stranger's pickup truck in the middle of a rainstorm. Marcus opened the passenger door, and helped her up into the worn bench seat. The interior smelled like motor oil and coffee, with a hint of the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. A child's school backpack sat on the floor, along with a collection of toy cars that had seen better days. Despite everything, Victoria found something comforting about these signs of normal family life, so different from her pristine but empty penthouse apartment. "My son Danny," Marcus explained, noticing her glance at the toys as he climbed behind the wheel. "He likes to keep me company when I run errands on weekends." The truck's engine turned over with a reassuring rumble, and Marcus immediately began backing out of the parking space. He drove with the confidence of someone who knew these roads intimately, navigating the storm-slicked pavement with steady precision. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the rain, but Marcus seemed unbothered by the limited visibility. "What's your name?" Victoria asked between shallow breaths, needing to focus on something other than the pain radiating through her chest. "Marcus Rivera," he replied, his eyes never leaving the road. "What's yours?" "Victoria," she answered, not adding her last name. Something about the anonymity felt liberating, like she could be just another person instead of the CEO whose face appeared regularly in business magazines. "Pretty name," Marcus said simply, then focused his attention on taking a sharp curve without losing traction. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a landscape of industrial buildings and farmland that Victoria rarely saw from the back seat of her company's town car. They drove in relative silence for several minutes, the only sounds the steady rhythm of rain and the truck's engine. Victoria found herself studying Marcus's profile in the dashboard's green glow. His face showed the kind of weathering that came from honest work and real responsibility, so different from the carefully maintained appearances of the executives she dealt with daily. "You don't have to do this," she said suddenly. "Taking a stranger to the hospital. Most people would have just called 911 and walked away." Marcus glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "My wife used to say that we're all just one bad day away from needing help from strangers. Seemed like you were having that kind of day." The past tense in his statement hung in the air between them. Victoria wanted to ask about his wife, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't a conversation for this moment. Instead, she found herself wondering when she'd last encountered such uncomplicated kindness, such immediate willingness to help without expecting anything in return. "Besides," Marcus continued with a slight smile, "Danny would never forgive me if I didn't help someone who needed it. He's got very strong opinions about doing the right thing, even when it's inconvenient." Victoria felt an unexpected warmth at the mention of his son, imagining a smaller version of Marcus with the same earnest expression and steady hands. In her corporate world, children were often seen as complications, obstacles to the kind of total dedication that climbing the executive ladder required. She'd made her choice long ago to focus on building Sterling Petroleum's empire rather than building a family, but moments like this made her wonder about the roads not taken. The hospital's emergency room sign appeared through the rain like a beacon, its Red Cross logo promising relief from the crushing pressure in her chest. Marcus pulled up to the emergency entrance with practiced efficiency, immediately jumping out to help Victoria from the truck despite the downpour. "I've got you," he said as she leaned heavily against him during the walk to the automatic doors. Just a few more steps. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room were harsh after the darkness of the storm, but Victoria had never been more grateful for their sterile welcome. A triage nurse looked up from her station as they approached, immediately recognizing the urgency of the situation. "Possible cardiac event," Marcus told the nurse without being asked, his voice clear and direct. "Chest pain, shortness of breath, left arm involvement, started about 30 minutes ago." The nurse's eyebrows raised slightly at his concise, accurate assessment, but she immediately began the intake process. A wheelchair appeared, and Victoria found herself being wheeled toward an examination room while Marcus handled the paperwork she was too disoriented to manage. "Insurance card?" the admitting clerk asked. Victoria gestured weakly toward her purse, which Marcus had thoughtfully grabbed from the truck. He handed it over without looking through it, another small gesture that spoke to his character. Most people given access to a stranger's personal belongings would at least be curious enough to peek. "Next of kin to notify," the clerk continued. Victoria paused, the question hitting her harder than expected. Her parents were gone, she'd never married, and her closest relationships were professional rather than personal. The realization that she was facing a potentially life-threatening situation with no one to call felt more frightening than the physical symptoms. "I'll stay until you get settled," Marcus offered quietly, understanding her hesitation without needing an explanation. The emergency room team worked with efficient professionalism, running tests and monitoring Victoria's vital signs while Marcus waited in the family area. He looked out of place among the comfortable chairs and motivational posters, his work clothes and weathered hands marking him as different from the usual visitors to this upscale medical facility. A young doctor emerged after what felt like hours but had probably been less than one. "Miss Sterling," he called, consulting his clipboard. Victoria looked up from the examination bed where they'd finally allowed her to rest. The pain had subsided somewhat with medication, but the fear lingered. "How bad is it?" "Good news," the doctor said with a reassuring smile. "Your heart appears to be fine. What you experienced was likely a severe anxiety attack combined with some dehydration and exhaustion. Your blood pressure was elevated, but that's consistent with stress rather than cardiac issues." The relief was overwhelming. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling tears she hadn't expected. All the pressure she'd been carrying, all the impossible standards she'd set for herself, had finally caught up with her body's ability to cope. "However," the doctor continued, "I want to keep you for observation for a few more hours just to be safe. And I strongly recommend you follow up with your primary physician about stress management. Your body was sending you a pretty clear message tonight." When Victoria emerged from the examination room, she found Marcus still waiting, despite the late hour and his obvious exhaustion. He looked up from the magazine he'd been pretending to read as she approached. "Everything okay?" he asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Anxiety attack," Victoria admitted, feeling somewhat embarrassed by the diagnosis. "Not actually dying, just felt like it." Marcus nodded with understanding rather than judgment. "Stress can do that. I've seen guys at the shop push themselves until their bodies just shut down. Your mind can only carry so much before something gives." They walked together toward the hospital's exit, the storm having finally passed while they'd been inside. The parking lot was still wet, but the air smelled clean and fresh, washed by the rain. Victoria realized she felt lighter somehow, as if the evening's events had released pressure she hadn't known she was carrying. "I need to pay you back," she said as they reached Marcus's truck. "For the gas, your time, everything you've done tonight." Marcus shook his head. "No need. Just glad you're all right." "But I insist," Victoria pressed. You used your last $5 to help a complete stranger. That kind of generosity deserves recognition. Marcus paused, his hand on the truck's door handle. How did you know it was my last $5? Victoria realized her mistake immediately. In her gratitude and exhaustion, she'd revealed knowledge she shouldn't have possessed. A truly random stranger wouldn't have known about his financial situation, wouldn't have understood the sacrifice he'd made by choosing to help her instead of solving his own problems. The silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken questions. Marcus's expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded, the easy trust of the evening beginning to crack under the weight of implications neither of them was ready to address. Lucky guess, Victoria said finally, but they both knew the explanation was insufficient. Marcus studied her face in the parking lot's harsh lighting, seeing her clearly for the first time without the distraction of emergency and crisis. Even disheveled and exhausted, there was something about her bearing, her unconscious authority, that suggested she was accustomed to being in control, to knowing things that others didn't. Who are you really? He asked quietly. Victoria met his gaze, recognizing that the strange, honest connection they'd forged tonight hung in the balance. She could lie, deflect, return to the safety of anonymity, and let him drive away believing he'd simply helped a stranger in need. Or she could trust him with a truth that would change everything between them. The decision would reshape both their lives in ways neither could imagine, setting in motion events that would test everything they thought they knew about class, loyalty, and the price of good intentions. But that choice, and its consequences, would have to wait for another moment, another conversation, another chance encounter that would prove some meetings are too important to be left to accident alone. The morning sun streamed through the cracked blinds of Marcus's small apartment, casting uneven patterns across the linoleum floor. Danny sat at their second-hand kitchen table, carefully arranging his breakfast of generic cereal and powdered milk while Marcus nursed his third cup of instant coffee. The electricity had been restored sometime during the night, though Marcus wasn't sure how that had happened. He'd expected to come home to a dark apartment, and a hungry child. "Dad, why do you look like you wrestled with a tornado?" Danny asked, studying his father's rumpled clothes and tired eyes with the brutal honesty only children possessed. Marcus managed a weary smile. "Just a long night, kiddo. Had to help someone who was in trouble." "Good trouble or bad trouble?" Danny pressed, using the distinction they'd developed over the years to categorize the various crises that seemed to find their way into their lives. "Good trouble," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was accurate. The memory of Victoria's slip about his financial situation nagged at him like a persistent engine knock that couldn't be diagnosed. The kind where you help someone even when it's hard. Danny nodded sagely, accepting this explanation with the trust of a child who'd learned that his father always tried to do the right thing, even when the right thing was complicated. "Are we still poor today?" The question hit Marcus harder than it should have. At 8 years old, Danny had developed an uncomfortable awareness of their financial struggles, a maturity that no child should need. "We're managing," Marcus said carefully. "Same as always." But as he drove to Rodriguez Auto Repair that morning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during those strange hours at the hospital. Victoria Sterling, if that was even her real name, had looked at him with recognition that went beyond gratitude. There had been something calculating in her eyes, something that suggested their meeting wasn't as random as it appeared. The garage was already bustling with activity when Marcus arrived. Rodriguez Auto Repair occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial side of town, its bay doors open to the morning air and the familiar sounds of pneumatic tools and radio music. Carlos Rodriguez, the owner, waved him over to the office with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," Carlos said, closing the office door behind them. The small space was cluttered with invoices, parts catalogs, and photographs of Carlos's extended family, a warm chaos that usually felt comfortable but today seemed cramped and confining. "If this is about yesterday," Marcus began, "I can explain why I was late this morning."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Carlos held up a hand to stop him. "It's not about that. We got a call this morning. Someone wants to contract our services for some high-end work, fleet maintenance for a corporate account, Big money, long-term contract. Marcus felt a chill of suspicion. What kind of corporation? Sterling Petroleum. Carlos said, watching Marcus's face carefully for a reaction. They specifically asked for you to handle the account. Seems you made quite an impression on someone. The pieces clicked into place with the finality of a well-fitted engine component. Victoria Sterling wasn't just someone with money. She was someone with the kind of money that came from oil wells and boardrooms, and the power to change lives with a phone call. Their meeting hadn't been coincidence at all. I can't take that account, Marcus said immediately. Carlos's eyebrows shot up. Are you insane? This is the kind of opportunity that could change everything for this shop. For all of us. Why would you turn down work like that? Because it's not really work, Marcus replied, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and disappointment. It's charity. Guilt money. Someone trying to ease their conscience by throwing contracts my way. So what? Carlos threw his hands up in exasperation. Money is money, Marcus. You think your pride is going to pay your rent? Feed your kid? We've all got bills, and this could solve a lot of problems for everyone here. Marcus understood his boss's frustration, but something deeper than financial need was at stake. He'd spent the past 3 years building a reputation based on honest work and fair dealing. Taking money from Victoria Sterling felt like accepting payment for being poor, for being the kind of person wealthy people could feel good about helping. Give me a day to think about it, Marcus said finally, knowing he needed time to sort through the implications of Victoria's offer. One day, Carlos agreed reluctantly. But Marcus, don't let your pride cost all of us a chance at something better. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine maintenance and minor repairs. But Marcus's mind kept returning to the woman who'd appeared in his life like a comet, bright and disruptive and impossible to ignore. By lunch break, he'd made a decision that surprised even him. The Sterling Petroleum building dominated the downtown skyline, its glass and steel facade reflecting the midday sun like a mirror. Marcus felt out of place in the marble lobby with its expensive artwork and hushed conversations, his work clothes and calloused hands marking him as an intruder in this world of suits and smartphones. The receptionist, a polished young woman with a smile that never reached her eyes, looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. Do you have an appointment? Tell Victoria Sterling that Marcus Rivera is here to see her, he said, matching her professional tone despite feeling like a fraud. The receptionist's expression shifted from dismissive to curious. She made a brief phone call, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up and studying Marcus with new interest. The executive elevator is to your right, 23rd floor. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor marking another step into territory where Marcus didn't belong. When the doors opened, he found himself facing another receptionist, this one older and more intimidating, who directed him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victoria was already waiting, but she looked nothing like the frightened woman from the night before. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her suit was clearly expensive and expertly tailored, and her entire bearing radiated the kind of authority that came from controlling millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. This was Victoria Sterling, CEO, not the vulnerable stranger who'd needed his help. Marcus, she said, rising from her chair with a smile that seemed genuine despite the dramatic change in circumstances. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure I would either, Marcus replied, taking the seat across from her at the polished conference table. But I needed to understand what last night was really about. Victoria's expression grew more serious. Last night was exactly what it appeared to be. A woman having a medical emergency and a good man who chose to help despite his own problems. Don't, Marcus said sharply. Don't pretend this is simple. You knew who I was before I ever walked into that diner. You knew about my situation, my son, my finances. That wasn't a coincidence. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently against the table's surface. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there the night before. You're right, it wasn't a coincidence. The admission hung between them like a challenge. Marcus had expected denial, deflection, maybe even anger at his accusation. He hadn't expected the straightforward acknowledgement that their meeting had been orchestrated. Sterling Petroleum has been looking for new vendors, Victoria continued. Local businesses that align with our community investment initiatives. Your shop came up in our research as a company with an excellent reputation and an owner who could benefit from expanded opportunities. Research, Marcus repeated, the word tasting bitter. You investigated me. We investigate all potential business partners, Victoria said calmly. It's standard due diligence. But yes, I knew about your financial difficulties, your son, your reputation in the community. What I didn't know was what kind of man you really were. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the clinical way she described turning his life into a case study, reducing his struggles to bullet points in a corporate presentation. So last night was what exactly? A test? You put yourself in danger to see if I'd help. The medical emergency was real, Victoria said firmly. The anxiety attack, the chest pain, all of it. But yes, when I realized who you were, I saw an opportunity to understand your character firsthand rather than relying on reports and references. And what did you learn? Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Victoria met his gaze directly, her expression softening slightly. I learned that you're exactly the kind of person this company should be working with. Someone who makes the right choice even when it costs them everything they have. Your $5, Marcus said, understanding flooding over him. You knew it was my last $5 because you'd already decided to test me with it. I knew you were struggling financially, Victoria admitted. But I didn't know about the $5 specifically until you mentioned it at the hospital. The fact that you helped me despite your own desperate situation told me everything I needed to know about your character. Marcus stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor. This is sick. You turned my life into some kind of corporate ethics experiment. Used my poverty as entertainment. That's not what this was, Victoria said, rising as well. Yes, I wanted to understand who you really were before entering into a business relationship. But nothing about last night was entertainment. Your kindness, your immediate willingness to help a stranger, the way you handled an emergency situation with calm competence, none of that was fabricated. But it was manipulated, Marcus shot back. You set up a situation where you could observe me like a lab rat, judge whether I was worthy of your company's charity. Victoria's composure cracked slightly, revealing a flash of something that might have been guilt or regret. It started as business research, yes, but it became something else. When you helped me into that truck, when you drove through a storm to get me to safety, when you stayed at the hospital even though you barely knew me. That wasn't part of any test. That was just you being who you are. And who am I according to your research? Marcus asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A single father who's been raising his son alone since his wife died 2 years ago. Victoria said quietly. A skilled mechanic who could have parlayed his experience into a management position, but chose to stay on the floor because he believes in honest work. A man who's turned down 3 job offers that would have required relocating because he didn't want to disrupt his son's life. Someone who volunteers at the community center teaching automotive basics to teenagers who can't afford trade school. Each fact hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were wrong but because they were so thoroughly researched, so clinically presented. His life had been reduced to a profile, his struggles quantified and categorized by people who'd never missed a meal or worried about keeping the lights on. You know what you missed in all that research, Marcus said, moving toward the door. You missed the fact that I have pride, that I don't want handouts, even when they come disguised as business opportunities. Your contract isn't about my skills or my shop's capabilities. It's about you feeling better about being rich while people like me struggle. Marcus, wait, Victoria called as he reached for the door handle. You're wrong about this. The contract is legitimate business. Your shop has the skills and reputation we need, and we're prepared to pay market rates for quality work. Marcus paused, his hand on the handle. Market rates determined by who? Your people or mine? Because in my experience, when corporations talk about helping local businesses, they're usually looking for cheap labor with a feel-good story attached. The rates are competitive with what you'd charge any other client, Victoria said. More than competitive actually. And the work is real, Marcus. Fleet maintenance, emergency repairs, custom modifications, things your team is already qualified to handle. Despite his anger, Marcus found himself curious about the specifics. It had been months since Rodriguez Auto Repair had landed a contract larger than routine maintenance for the local taxi company. A corporate account could mean steady work, reliable income, the kind of financial stability that would let him stop worrying about whether Danny had enough to eat. Even if that's true, Marcus said, it doesn't change the fact that you investigated my personal life, used my situation to manipulate me into proving myself worthy of your business. How am I supposed to trust someone who thinks that's acceptable? Victoria walked around the conference table to face him directly, her executive mask slipping to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. You're right to be angry. I handled this badly, and I'm sorry for that. But Marcus, can you honestly tell me you wouldn't have done the same research if someone wanted to give you $1 million contract? Wouldn't you want to know who you were dealing with? I wouldn't have staged a fake emergency to test their character, Marcus replied. But some of the heat had gone out of his voice. It wasn't fake, Victoria said again. The emergency was real. My reaction to discovering who you were, that was where I made the wrong choice. I should have identified myself immediately. Should have been honest about why I knew your name. Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Last night's medical emergency might have been triggered by stress, but he could see now that the stress was ongoing, relentless, the price of running a company worth billions of dollars. Why me? He asked finally. With all the auto shops in the city, all the qualified mechanics, why target Rodriguez Auto Repair specifically? Victoria returned to her chair, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. After a moment's hesitation, he sat back down, his curiosity overriding his anger. Sterling Petroleum is changing, Victoria said. We're moving away from the old model of extracting resources and maximizing profits regardless of consequences. The new board wants community investment, environmental responsibility, sustainable business practices. Part of that means working with local vendors instead of national chains, supporting businesses that share our values. And you think my shop shares your values? Marcus asked skeptically. I think you do, Victoria replied. The research showed that you've been working on hybrid vehicle conversions in your spare time, experimenting with alternative fuel systems, teaching clean energy concepts to those kids at the community center. That's exactly the kind of innovation we want to support. Marcus was surprised she knew about his side projects. The hybrid work was something he did for his own curiosity, trying to understand how traditional automotive skills could adapt to changing technology. He'd never considered it valuable enough to mention to potential clients. That's just tinkering, he said dismissively. Nothing commercial about it. Yet, Victoria said with a smile that seemed more genuine than her earlier corporate polish. But Sterling Petroleum isn't just looking for vendors, Marcus. We're looking for partners, people who can help us navigate the transition to cleaner energy while maintaining the mechanical expertise that keeps our equipment running. The scope of what she was describing began to dawn on Marcus. This wasn't just about maintaining a few company cars or fixing broken generators. Victoria was talking about being involved in the future of energy production, about bridging the gap between old technology and new possibilities. What exactly are you offering? Marcus asked, his tone shifting from confrontational to professionally curious. Victoria pulled out a folder that had been sitting on the table throughout their conversation. A 3-year maintenance contract for our local fleet worth approximately $2 million annually. Additionally, consulting opportunities on hybrid and alternative fuel projects, with compensation based on time and expertise contributed. The numbers were staggering. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, but his mind was already calculating what that kind of money could mean for the shop, for his employees, for Danny's future. College tuition, a house in a better neighborhood, financial security he'd never imagined possible. And in exchange, Marcus asked, knowing there had to be conditions attached to such a generous offer. Quality work, delivered on time and within budget, Victoria said simply. The same standards you'd apply to any client. No special favors, no shortcuts because we're paying well. Just the honest workmanship that built your reputation. It sounded too good to be true, which in Marcus's experience usually meant it was. But sitting across from Victoria in her corporate conference room, watching her present the offer with straightforward professionalism, he found himself wanting to believe that sometimes good things really did happen to people who needed them. I need to discuss this with Carlos, Marcus said finally. And I need guarantees that this contract won't disappear the first time we disagree about something or fail to meet some unwritten expectation. Of course, Victoria agreed. Our legal team can work with yours to ensure the terms are clear and fair. No hidden clauses, no performance requirements beyond industry standards. Marcus almost laughed at the mention of their legal team. Rodriguez Auto Repair's legal representation consisted of Carlos's brother-in-law, who handled their insurance claims and occasional disputes with parts suppliers. They were about to negotiate with corporate lawyers who probably charged more per hour than Marcus made in a week. This is overwhelming, Marcus admitted. 24 hours ago, I was worried about keeping the lights on. Now you're talking about contracts worth millions of dollars. It doesn't feel real. Victoria's expression softened, and for a moment she looked more like the frightened woman from the diner than the powerful executive. I understand that feeling. Sometimes I still can't believe I'm running a company this size. The responsibility can be paralyzing if you let yourself think about it too much.
How do you handle it? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how someone managed the pressure of making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Carefully, Victoria said with a rueful smile. And with a lot of help from people who know more than I do about specific areas. That's why partnerships like this are important to me, Marcus. I can't be an expert in automotive repair and environmental science and petroleum engineering and community development. But I can recognize expertise when I see it and create opportunities for experts to work together. The conversation had shifted from confrontation to something approaching collaboration, and Marcus found himself reassessing not just the contract offer but Victoria herself. The corporate research and staged meetings still bothered him, but he was beginning to understand the pressures that might have led to such decisions. If we do this, Marcus said slowly. If Rodriguez Auto Repair enters into this partnership, I need your word that you'll be honest with me going forward. No more tests, no more manipulation, no more treating me like a case study in corporate social responsibility. You have my word, Victoria said immediately. Complete transparency in all our business dealings. And I want to meet with your technical people, Marcus continued, warming to the negotiation. If you're serious about innovation and alternative energy, I want to understand what you're really working on, not just the public relations version. Victoria nodded approvingly. Absolutely. In fact, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Chen, our head of research and development. She's been pushing for exactly the kind of automotive partnerships we're discussing. The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details, timeline expectations and contract procedures. By the time Marcus left the Sterling Petroleum building, his head was spinning with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. The opportunity was genuine, more generous than anything he'd dared hope for, but the circumstances of its origin still left him uneasy. The drive back to the garage gave him time to process what had just happened. Victoria Sterling had admitted to researching his personal life, to using their chance meeting as an opportunity to evaluate his character. But she'd also offered him a path to financial security and professional growth that could transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone who worked at Rodriguez Auto Repair. Carlos was waiting when Marcus returned, his expression anxious and hopeful in equal measure. Well, what did you decide about the Sterling contract? It's more complicated than we thought, Marcus said, settling into the office's single visitor chair. And it's also more promising than we imagined. He spent the next 30 minutes explaining the details of Victoria's offer, watching Carlos's eyes widen as the scope and value of the opportunity became clear. When Marcus finished, his boss sat back in his chair with a low whistle. $2 million a year, Carlos repeated. Marcus, that's enough to expand the shop, hire more mechanics, maybe even open a second location. We could become a real player in the city's automotive market. I know, Marcus said. But Carlos, there's something else you need to understand about how this all started. He explained about the previous night's events, about Victoria's admission that their meeting wasn't coincidental, about the research Sterling Petroleum had conducted into his personal life. Carlos listened with growing amazement, occasionally shaking his head at the strangeness of the situation. So let me get this straight, Carlos said. When Marcus finished, the CEO of Sterling Petroleum staged a medical emergency to test whether you were worth doing business with. She says the emergency was real, Marcus corrected. But yes, she used the situation to evaluate my character. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. That's either really smart business or really crazy personal behavior. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, Marcus admitted. The question is whether we can trust her to honor the contract terms if we accept. Marcus, Carlos said seriously. I've been running this shop for 15 years. I've dealt with corporate clients before, and most of them see us as interchangeable vendors. If Sterling Petroleum is offering genuine partnership opportunities, if they're willing to pay market rates for quality work, then their CEO's unconventional recruitment methods might be worth overlooking. You think we should take the contract? I think we should investigate it thoroughly, Carlos replied. Get our lawyer to review every clause, talk to their technical people, maybe even visit some of their other vendors to see how they handle relationships. But Marcus, opportunities like this don't come along often. We can't let pride or principle cost us a chance at real success. Marcus knew his boss was right, but something deeper than business considerations was driving his hesitation. Taking Victoria's contract felt like accepting that his life was something that could be researched, evaluated, and ultimately purchased. It reduced his integrity to a commodity that had market value for the right buyer. What if this is just the beginning? Marcus asked. What if every major decision we make, every hire, every expansion becomes subject to Sterling Petroleum's approval? What if we lose our independence in exchange for their money? Then we negotiate protections into the contract. Carlos said pragmatically. We set boundaries, define scope, ensure that our business remains our business even while we're working with theirs. The afternoon shift was beginning, and the sounds of the working garage filtered through the office walls. Pneumatic tools, radio music, friendly arguments about sports and politics. This was Marcus's world, the place where he'd learned that honest work had its own dignity, that solving problems with your hands created value that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. Give me the weekend, Marcus said finally. Let me think about this, talk to Danny, figure out what accepting this contract would really mean for our family. Carlos nodded, understanding that the decision involved more than business calculations. But Marcus, don't take too long. Opportunities like this have a way of disappearing if you hesitate too much. The rest of the workday passed in a blur of routine tasks, but Marcus's mind kept returning to Victoria's offer and the questions it raised about the relationship between need and dignity, between opportunity and independence. By closing time, he'd made one decision that surprised him. He was going to see Victoria Sterling again, but this time on his own terms in his own territory. That evening, after dinner and homework and the comfortable routines of single parenthood, Marcus found himself standing in his small workshop behind the apartment building. The space was cramped and poorly lit, filled with salvaged parts and half-finished projects that represented his attempts to understand the changing world of automotive technology. In the corner sat his latest experiment, a 20-year-old Honda Civic that he'd been converting to hybrid operation using salvaged components and innovative engineering. The work was slow and often frustrating, limited by his budget and the inadequate workspace, but it represented something important to Marcus, proof that traditional mechanical skills could adapt to new challenges. Looking at the car now, He tried to imagine what it would be like to work on similar projects with unlimited resources, proper equipment, and the support of Sterling Petroleum's research team. The possibilities were exciting and terrifying in equal measure, representing a future he'd never dared envision for himself. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number, but he recognized the careful professional tone immediately. "Marcus, I know our meeting today didn't go exactly as planned. If you're willing, I'd like to continue our conversation in a more informal setting. Would you be free for coffee tomorrow evening? Victoria." Marcus stared at the message for a long time, weighing his response. Meeting Victoria again would mean acknowledging that he was seriously considering her offer, that despite his anger about her methods, he was intrigued by the opportunities she'd presented. But it would also give him a chance to understand who she really was beneath the corporate exterior, to judge whether partnership with Sterling Petroleum was worth the risks it entailed. He typed his response carefully. "Coffee sounds good. But I picked the place. Rico's Diner on 5th Street. 7 o'clock. The choice of location was deliberate. Rico's Diner was the kind of place where Marcus felt comfortable, where the coffee was strong and cheap, and the conversations were real. If Victoria Sterling wanted to continue their business discussion, she could do it in his world instead of hers. Her response came quickly. "Perfect. See you there." Marcus put his phone aside and returned to his hybrid project, but his mind was already working through the conversation he wanted to have with Victoria. There were questions about Sterling Petroleum's real intentions, about the sustainability of their community investment initiatives, about what would happen to small vendors like Rodriguez Auto Repair if corporate priorities shifted. But there were also questions about Victoria herself, about the woman who'd been vulnerable enough to have an anxiety attack in a roadside diner, and powerful enough to offer million-dollar contracts the next day. Understanding those contradictions might be the key to deciding whether their partnership could work, whether trust could be built on a foundation that had started with deception and manipulation. The hybrid Honda sat silent in the dim workshop light, its mismatched components a testament to the possibility that different systems could work together if properly integrated. Marcus hoped the same principle might apply to the unlikely partnership Victoria was proposing, but he knew that unlike mechanical systems, human relationships couldn't be fixed with the right tools and sufficient patience. Tomorrow's conversation would determine whether Victoria Sterling was offering genuine partnership or simply a more sophisticated form of charity. Either way, Marcus was determined to enter into it with his eyes open and his principles intact, ready to walk away if the terms weren't right but equally prepared to embrace an opportunity that could change everything for his family and his community. Rico's Diner buzzed with its usual evening crowd of construction workers, night shift nurses, and college students surviving on coffee and determination. The familiar chaos of clinking dishes and overlapping conversations created a soundtrack that Marcus found comforting, a sharp contrast to the sterile quiet of corporate conference rooms. He arrived 10 minutes early, claiming a corner booth that offered privacy while keeping him visible to the entire restaurant. When Victoria walked through the door at exactly 7 o'clock, every conversation in the diner seemed to pause. Her business attire had been replaced by dark jeans and a simple sweater, but she still carried herself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The hostess, Maria, who'd known Marcus since Danny was a toddler, raised an eyebrow at his unexpected dinner companion, but simply pointed toward his booth with a knowing smile. "This is more my speed," Marcus said as Victoria slid into the seat across from him, gesturing at the worn vinyl and chipped formica that surrounded them. "I can see why you'd be comfortable here," Victoria replied, scanning the room with genuine interest rather than the polite distaste he'd expected. "It feels authentic. Real." The comment struck Marcus as both perceptive and slightly condescending, though he couldn't tell if the condescension was intentional. "As opposed to what?" "As opposed to the sterile environments where I usually conduct business," Victoria said with a self-deprecating smile. "Boardrooms designed to intimidate, restaurants chosen for their exclusivity rather than their food. Places where image matters more than substance." Maria appeared at their table with coffee for Marcus and a questioning look for Victoria. "What can I get you, honey?" "Coffee, please," Victoria said. "Black." "Food." Maria pressed, clearly protective of Marcus and suspicious of any woman who might be taking advantage of his generous nature. "We'll see," Marcus said diplomatically. "Give us a few minutes, Maria." When they were alone again, Victoria wrapped her hands around the steaming mug Maria had delivered, inhaling the rich aroma with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "This is excellent coffee. Rico sources it himself," Marcus explained. "Drives down to Guatemala every winter to work directly with the farmers. Says it's the only way to ensure quality and fair prices." "Smart business model," Victoria observed. "Vertical integration, supply chain control, direct relationships with producers. Very efficient." Marcus found himself annoyed by her instinct to reduce Rico's personal passion to corporate buzzwords. "It's not about efficiency. Rico grew up poor in Guatemala. This is his way of giving back while building something he can be proud of." Victoria paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips, recognition dawning in her expression. "I did it again, didn't I? Turned someone's personal story into a business case study." "Yeah," Marcus said bluntly. "You did." "I'm sorry," Victoria said, and this time the apology sounded genuine rather than diplomatic. "It's an occupational hazard. When you spend your days thinking about markets and strategies, it becomes hard to see individual motivation beyond those frameworks." "Is that what happened with me?" Marcus asked. "You couldn't see past the business opportunity to understand that my life isn't a case study." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "Partly," she admitted finally. "But Marcus, there's something else you need to understand about why I handled our meeting the way I did." "I'm listening." Victoria glanced around the busy diner, clearly uncomfortable with the public setting for what she was about to reveal. "Sterling Petroleum is under siege right now. Environmental groups, government regulators, activist investors, all demanding fundamental changes to how we operate. The old guard on the board wants to fight these pressures, to maintain traditional business models regardless of consequences. And you disagree." "I believe adaptation is survival," Victoria said firmly. "But implementing change in a company with Sterling's history requires careful strategy. Every partnership, every initiative, every public statement gets scrutinized by people looking for evidence that we're either not serious about reform or that we're abandoning our core competencies." Marcus began to understand the pressure Victoria was operating under, but it didn't excuse her methods. "So you needed to be absolutely certain that any partnership you entered into would reflect well on your judgment." "More than that," Victoria continued. "I needed partners who shared genuine commitment to innovation and community development, not just companies willing to take our money in exchange for positive publicity. The research we conducted wasn't just about evaluating potential vendors. It was about finding allies in the transition we're trying to make." "Allies," Marcus repeated, testing the word. "Is that what you think we could be?" "I hope so," Victoria said, meeting his gaze directly. "But that depends on whether you can trust me, despite the questionable way we met, and whether I can prove that Sterling Petroleum's commitment to change is more than just corporate public relations." The conversation was interrupted by Maria's return, this time accompanied by Rico himself, a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and hands that showed decades of kitchen work. "Marcus," Rico said warmly. "You going to introduce me to your friend?" "Victoria Sterling," Marcus said, watching Rico's reaction to the familiar surname. "Victoria, this is Rico Gutierrez, the owner." Rico's expression shifted slightly, recognizing the name but maintaining his naturally gracious demeanor. "Miss Sterling. Welcome to my place. You treating my friend Marcus well?" "I'm trying to," Victoria said with a smile that seemed more relaxed than any expression Marcus had seen from her in either of their previous meetings. "He's a hard man to impress." "Good," Rico said approvingly. "Marcus deserves someone who appreciates what he brings to the table. You want some food? Tonight's special is carnitas, and I promise you won't find better anywhere in the city." Victoria accepted the recommendation without checking prices or asking about ingredients, a small gesture that suggested she was making an effort to adapt to the environment rather than expecting it to accommodate her. When Rico had returned to the kitchen, she turned back to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "He's protective of you," she observed. "Rico gave me my first job when I moved here with Danny," Marcus explained. "Washing dishes in the evenings after my regular shift at the garage. Never asked why I needed the extra work, just put me to work and made sure I got fed while I was here." That's the kind of loyalty money can't buy. Victoria said quietly. No, it's not. Marcus agreed. It's earned through consistency, through showing up when people need you, through proving that your word means something. The implication hung between them, a challenge and an opportunity in equal measure. Victoria seemed to understand that Marcus was describing the foundation any successful partnership would require, standards she'd already failed to meet through her deceptive approach to their relationship. How do I earn that kind of trust? Victoria asked directly. By starting over, Marcus said. By being honest about what you want and what you're offering, without manipulation or performance evaluation disguised as chance meetings. Okay, Victoria said simply. Let's start over. She extended her hand across the table in a formal gesture that felt oddly appropriate given the circumstances. Hello, I'm Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Petroleum. We're looking for automotive partners who can help us transition to more sustainable operations while maintaining the mechanical expertise our business requires. Marcus shook her hand, appreciating the directness even as he recognized the calculated nature of the gesture. Marcus Rivera, head mechanic at Rodriguez Auto Repair. We specialize in quality work at fair prices, and we're interested in opportunities that don't compromise our principles. Excellent, Victoria said with a grin that transformed her entire face, revealing a sense of humor that had been carefully hidden behind corporate professionalism. Now that we've been properly introduced, can we discuss the specifics of what a partnership might look like? The carnitas arrived before Marcus could respond, accompanied by fresh tortillas, pico de gallo, and Rico's famous verde sauce.
Victoria dove into the meal with enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than performative, asking questions about the preparation and complementing the complex flavors with the appreciation of someone who understood good food. This is incredible, she said between bites. I can see why you come here regularly. Rico's like family, Marcus said. When Elena died, he made sure Danny and I ate dinner here 3 nights a week for months, never asked for payment, never made it feel like charity. Just took care of us when we couldn't take care of ourselves. Victoria paused in her eating, recognizing the significance of what Marcus had shared. Your wife died 2 years ago. Cancer, Marcus said simply. Quick and brutal. One day she was fine. 6 months later she was gone. Left me with a 7-year-old who didn't understand why his mother wouldn't wake up and medical bills that wiped out everything we'd saved. I'm sorry, Victoria said, and the corporate polish disappeared entirely, replaced by genuine sympathy. That must have been devastating. It was, Marcus acknowledged, but it also taught me what really matters. Community, family, people who show up when life gets hard. Everything else is just noise. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, the weight of Marcus's revelation settling between them. Victoria seemed to be processing not just the information but its implications for how she'd approached their relationship. The research Sterling Petroleum conducted, she said finally. It mentioned your wife's death but not the circumstances. I didn't understand the full impact on your family. Would it have changed your approach? Marcus asked. Victoria considered the question seriously. I'd like to think so, but honestly I'm not sure. The pressure to make decisions based on data rather than emotion is constant in my position. Sometimes that leads to treating people like statistics rather than human beings. Then maybe you need better data, Marcus suggested. Information that includes context, motivation, the things that make people more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. You're probably right, Victoria admitted. But that kind of understanding requires time and relationship building. Resources that are always in short supply when you're managing a company the size of Sterling Petroleum. Maybe that's part of the problem, Marcus said. Maybe rushing to judgment based on incomplete information creates more problems than it solves. Victoria set down her fork and looked directly at Marcus, her expression serious but not defensive. You're challenging everything about how I've been approaching business partnerships. Good, Marcus replied. If Sterling Petroleum really wants to change, if you're serious about community investment and sustainable operations, then you need partners who will challenge your assumptions, not just validate your decisions. Is that what you'd do? Victoria asked.
Challenge us when you think we're making mistakes. If you hired Rodriguez Auto Repair to maintain your fleet and I saw problems with your vehicles that you weren't addressing, would you want me to stay quiet to avoid conflict? Of course not, Victoria said immediately. I'd want you to identify problems before they became disasters. Same principle applies to business partnerships. Marcus said, if you want honest work, you have to accept honest feedback, even when it's uncomfortable. Victoria nodded slowly, seeming to understand that Marcus was describing a fundamentally different relationship than the vendor arrangements Sterling Petroleum typically maintained. That would require trust on both sides. It would, Marcus agreed. Trust that takes time to build and can be destroyed by a single moment of dishonesty. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the diner's entrance. A young man in work clothes was arguing with Maria about something, his voice rising with frustration and embarrassment. Marcus recognized the situation immediately, the particular kind of distress that came from wanting to pay for something you couldn't afford. Excuse me for a minute, Marcus said, sliding out of the booth before Victoria could respond. He approached the young man carefully, recognizing him as Jake Morrison, a kid who'd been attending Marcus's automotive classes at the community center. Jake was 19, working construction to support his younger siblings after their father had abandoned the family, and struggling to make ends meet despite working 60-hour weeks. Hey Jake, Marcus said quietly. Everything okay? Jake's face flushed with embarrassment at being recognized in the middle of his financial crisis. Just having trouble with my card, he mumbled, though Marcus could see the rejection slip the cashier had handed him. Without making a scene, Marcus pulled out his wallet and handed Maria enough cash to cover Jake's order. Put it on my tab, he said casually, as if this were a routine arrangement rather than a spontaneous act of generosity. Marcus, I can't let you do that, Jake protested, but Marcus waved off his objections. You can pay me back when you get your first paycheck as a certified mechanic, Marcus said with a smile. Consider it an investment in your education. Jake's eyes welled up with gratitude, but Marcus had already returned to his booth, leaving the young man to collect his food and dignity without further attention. Victoria had watched the entire interaction with intense focus, clearly understanding the significance of what she'd witnessed. That was well done, she said as Marcus settled back into his seat. Jake's eyes welled up with gratitude, but Marcus said dismissively, he'll figure things out. You do that often? Victoria asked. Help people when they're struggling. Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. When I can. Rico does the same thing. Lots of people in the neighborhood do. It's not charity, it's community. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, seemingly lost in thought. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking about community investment all wrong. How so? I've been approaching it like a business problem to be solved with contracts and procedures and measurable outcomes. Victoria said slowly. But what you just did with Jake, what Rico did for your family after your wife died, that's not about systems or strategies. It's about relationships, about understanding that everyone's struggling with something. Marcus nodded, recognizing that Victoria was beginning to grasp concepts that couldn't be captured in corporate mission statements or quarterly reports. Community investment isn't something you do to people or for people. It's something you do with people. And that requires the kind of trust and understanding that can't be fast-tracked through research and background checks. Victoria continued, working through the implications of this realization. Right, Marcus confirmed. It requires showing up consistently, proving your commitment through actions over time, earning your place in the community rather than buying it. Victoria leaned back in the booth, looking simultaneously frustrated and enlightened. This conversation is making me question everything about how Sterling Petroleum has been approaching community relations. Maybe that's necessary, Marcus suggested. Maybe questioning everything is the first step toward building something better. It is, Victoria agreed. But it's also terrifying when you're responsible for thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in assets. The margin for error is so small, and the consequences of getting it wrong are so large. Marcus understood the pressure she was describing, But he also recognized the trap it created. Fear of making mistakes can paralyze you into making no decisions at all. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks based on incomplete information. Like trusting a mechanic you met in a crisis situation to handle million-dollar contracts. Victoria asked with a wry smile. Like that, Marcus confirmed. Though I'd argue that crisis situations reveal character more clearly than carefully planned interviews. They do, Victoria agreed. Which is why I'm sitting here having the most honest business conversation I've had in years, instead of conducting another formal meeting in a conference room designed to intimidate potential partners. The diner had begun to empty as the evening wore on, leaving Marcus and Victoria with more privacy for the detailed discussions that their partnership would require. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened a notes application, her fingers poised to capture the key points of their conversation. "Tell me about your vision for Rodriguez Auto Repair," she said. "Not just what you do now, but what you could become with the right resources and support." Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about dreams he'd kept private for fear they were too ambitious for someone in his position. "I'd like to create a training center," he said finally. "A place where kids like Jake can learn automotive skills while also understanding how traditional mechanical knowledge applies to new technologies. Hybrid systems, electric vehicles, alternative fuels, all the changes that are coming whether we're ready for them or not. A bridge between old and new," Victoria said, making notes as he spoke. "Exactly," Marcus continued, warming to the subject. "There are thousands of experienced mechanics in this city who understand engines and transmissions and electrical systems, but they're afraid of being left behind by technological change. At the same time, there are brilliant young engineers who understand new technologies but have never actually fixed anything with their hands. And you think bringing those groups together would benefit both?" "I think it's essential," Marcus said firmly. "The future of automotive technology isn't going to be built by people who only understand computers or only understand carburetors. It's going to require people who can bridge those worlds, who can apply practical problem-solving skills to cutting-edge innovations." Victoria's eyes lit up with excitement as she grasped the implications of what Marcus was describing. "That's exactly what Sterling Petroleum needs. We're sitting on billions of dollars worth of traditional energy infrastructure, but we're trying to transition to cleaner technologies without losing the operational expertise that makes our current systems work. Same challenge, bigger scale," Marcus observed. "How do you maintain what works while adapting to what's coming?" "Right," Victoria said enthusiastically. "And the answer isn't to abandon everything we know in favor of completely new approaches. It's to find ways to integrate traditional knowledge with innovative solutions." The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical possibilities, training methodologies, and the practical challenges of implementing new programs within existing organizational structures. Marcus found himself impressed by Victoria's ability to grasp complex concepts quickly, and to see connections between seemingly unrelated issues. More importantly, he found himself beginning to trust her, not because she'd proven herself trustworthy through her actions, but because she was demonstrating a willingness to question her own assumptions, to admit uncertainty, and to approach problems from perspectives that went beyond immediate financial return. "This has been the most productive business discussion I've had in months," Victoria said as they prepared to leave the diner. "And I haven't looked at a single PowerPoint presentation or financial projection. Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding problems rather than analyzing data," Marcus replied, standing to shake hands with Rico, who had emerged from the kitchen to personally thank Victoria for choosing his restaurant. "Miss Sterling," Rico said warmly, "you come back anytime. Anyone who appreciates good food and treats my friend Marcus with respect is always welcome here." "I'll definitely be back," Victoria promised, and Marcus could tell she meant it. Outside the diner, they stood for a moment in the warm evening air, neither quite ready to end a conversation that had exceeded both their expectations. The street was quiet except for distant traffic and the soft sounds of families settling in for the night. "Where do we go from here?" Victoria asked. "I'd like to see Sterling Petroleum's research and development facilities," Marcus said. "If we're going to discuss technical partnerships, I need to understand what you're actually working on, not just what gets announced in press releases. Absolutely, Victoria agreed. I'll arrange a meeting with Dr. Sarah Chen, our head of R&D. She's been advocating for exactly the kind of partnerships we've been discussing. And I'd like you to spend some time at Rodriguez Auto Repair, Marcus added. See how we actually work, meet the team, understand what we can and can't realistically accomplish. Victoria nodded approvingly. A mutual evaluation process instead of one-sided research. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Trust has to be built both ways. They exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for the following week, but as Victoria prepared to leave, Marcus felt compelled to address one final concern. Victoria, he said seriously, I need you to understand that if we do enter into a partnership, Rodriguez Auto Repair isn't going to become a subsidiary of Sterling Petroleum. We'll work with you, but we won't work for you. The distinction matters. I understand, Victoria replied. And Marcus, I need you to understand that Sterling Petroleum's commitment to community investment isn't dependent on immediate returns or perfect outcomes. We're looking for long-term partnerships that create value for everyone involved, not just quick wins that make us look good in quarterly reports. They shook hands again, a gesture that felt different from their earlier formal introduction. This time, Marcus sensed the beginning of mutual respect based on honest communication rather than corporate courtesy. As Victoria walked toward her car, a sleek sedan that looked out of place in the working-class neighborhood but not offensively so, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his perception of her had shifted over the course of a single evening. The calculating corporate executive who'd manipulated their first meeting had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely committed to finding ways for different worlds to work together productively. The drive home gave Marcus time to process the implications of what they'd discussed. Partnership with Sterling Petroleum could provide resources and opportunities beyond anything he'd imagined, but it would also require navigating complex corporate politics and maintaining his principles in an environment where compromise was often seen as weakness. Danny was already asleep when Marcus arrived home, but he found a note on the kitchen table asking about the previous night's adventure and whether his dad had solved any mysteries during his evening out. The question made Marcus smile, recognizing his son's growing awareness that their lives were becoming more complicated in ways that might be positive rather than threatening. Marcus spent another hour in his workshop, working on the hybrid Honda and thinking about the training center he'd described to Victoria. The project had seemed like an impossible dream when he'd started it, a way to stay current with changing technology while maintaining connection to traditional mechanical principles. Now, with Sterling Petroleum's resources potentially available, it might become the foundation for something much larger. The phone call came just as Marcus was preparing for bed, Victoria's name appearing on the caller ID with an urgency that made him immediately concerned. Marcus, she said without preamble, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, Marcus replied, settling into the chair by his bedroom window. Tonight at the diner, when you helped that young man with his bill, was that performance for my benefit or something you would have done regardless of whether I was watching? The question revealed more about Victoria's worldview than Marcus found comfortable, suggesting that she still struggled to distinguish between genuine behavior and calculated presentation. But it also showed that she was trying to understand the difference, which seemed like progress. Victoria, Marcus said patiently, if I were the kind of person who performed generosity for an audience, would I be someone you'd want to partner with? No, she said immediately, but I've been burned before by people who presented themselves as one thing while being something else entirely. Learning to distinguish between authentic behavior and skilled manipulation is a survival skill in my business. Then maybe you need to spend less time in environments where that kind of deception is normal, Marcus suggested. Maybe you need to find ways to evaluate character that don't involve testing people without their knowledge. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. You're right, she said finally. And Marcus, what I saw tonight, the way you handled that situation with Jake, the way Rico and Maria clearly care about you and your family, the way you talked about community investment as relationship building rather than strategic positioning, all of that tells me more about your character than any background check ever could. Good, Marcus said, "Because that's who I really am, not who I think you want me to be." "I know," Victoria replied. "And that's exactly why Sterling Petroleum needs partners like Rodriguez Auto Repair. Not just for your technical skills but for your perspective on what business relationships should actually accomplish." After they hung up, Marcus found himself cautiously optimistic about the possibilities Victoria represented. The woman who'd called him at nearly midnight to ask about his motivations was someone who seemed capable of growth, someone willing to question her own assumptions and adapt her approaches based on new information. Whether that willingness would survive the pressures of corporate politics and quarterly earnings reports remained to be seen. But Marcus was beginning to believe that partnership with Sterling Petroleum might be possible without compromising the values that had guided Rodriguez Auto Repair's success. The next few days would bring new challenges and revelations, tests of trust that would determine whether two very different worlds could find common ground in their shared commitment to honest work and community development. But for the first time since Victoria Sterling had appeared in his life, Marcus felt like those tests might be worth taking. The Sterling Petroleum Research Facility occupied a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city, its modern architecture standing in stark contrast to the industrial warehouses and aging factories that surrounded it. Marcus pulled his pickup truck into the visitor parking area, feeling the familiar discomfort that came with entering spaces designed for people who owned cars worth more than his annual salary. Dr. Sarah Chen met him at the security checkpoint, a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and the practical demeanor of someone who spent more time solving problems than attending meetings. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and Marcus found himself immediately more at ease than he'd expected. "Marcus Rivera," she said as they walked through the facility's main corridor. "Victoria's told me quite a bit about you. I understand you've been working on hybrid conversions in your spare time." "Nothing too sophisticated," Marcus replied, surprised that Victoria had shared technical details rather than just business considerations. "Mostly trying to understand how traditional mechanical systems can interface with electric components." "That's exactly the kind of practical knowledge we need more of," Sarah said, leading him toward a bank of elevators. "We have brilliant engineers who can design theoretical solutions, but implementation often reveals problems that don't show up in computer models." The research floor buzzed with quiet activity, teams of engineers and technicians working on projects that ranged from solar panel efficiency improvements to advanced battery storage systems. Marcus noticed immediately that the workspace felt different from typical corporate environments, more like an expanded version of his own workshop than the sterile laboratories he'd imagined. "This is our automotive development section," Sarah said, stopping at a workstation where several people were examining what appeared to be a hybrid engine prototype. "We're trying to develop retrofit kits that can convert existing fleet vehicles to cleaner operation without requiring complete replacement." Marcus approached the prototype with professional interest, immediately recognizing both the sophistication of the engineering and the practical challenges it would present for field installation. The system was elegant but complex, requiring specialized tools and extensive technical knowledge to implement properly. "Beautiful work," he said, running his fingers along the integrated components. "But this would take a certified technician at least 40 hours to install, assuming no complications." "That's been our biggest concern," Sarah admitted. "The technology works perfectly in controlled conditions, but we're worried about real-world implementation challenges." "May I?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the engine bay where the prototype was mounted. At Sarah's nod, he began examining the system with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent years diagnosing mechanical problems under deadline pressure. "The integration points are too complex," Marcus observed after several minutes of careful inspection. "You've optimized for efficiency and performance, but you haven't considered the human factor. A mechanic working in a commercial garage under time pressure is going to make mistakes with connections this intricate." Sarah made notes as Marcus spoke, clearly valuing his perspective despite the informal nature of his assessment. "What would you suggest?" "Simplify the interfaces," Marcus said immediately. "Color-coded connections, foolproof mounting systems, diagnostic indicators that tell you immediately if something's wrong. The technology can be sophisticated, but the installation process needs to be intuitive." "Show me," Sarah said, handing him a tablet connected to the prototype's diagnostic system. Marcus spent the next hour working through potential modifications, his suggestions informed by years of experience with mechanics who ranged from highly skilled professionals to well-meaning amateurs. Sarah's team listened with growing excitement as he described installation procedures that could reduce complexity while maintaining system integrity. "This is exactly what we've been missing," Sarah said as they concluded the technical discussion. "We've been designing for perfect conditions instead of real-world applications." "It's a common problem," Marcus replied diplomatically. "Engineering in isolation versus engineering for implementation." The tour continued through laboratories working on energy storage, environmental remediation, and advanced materials research. Each stop revealed projects that impressed Marcus with their ambition and innovation, but also challenges that suggested Sterling Petroleum was serious about technological transformation rather than simply pursuing public relations improvements. "Victoria mentioned that you're interested in developing training programs," Sarah said as they entered her office, a space that managed to be both professional and comfortable, with technical journals scattered across surfaces and photographs of field research projects covering one wall. Eventually, Marcus confirmed. "The automotive industry is changing faster than most mechanics can adapt. Traditional skills are still valuable, but they need to be integrated with new knowledge." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "We've been struggling with the same issue. Our senior engineers understand petroleum systems inside and out, but they're intimidated by renewable technologies. Meanwhile, our younger engineers are brilliant with clean energy concepts but have never actually maintained equipment in harsh field conditions. What if those groups work together?" Marcus suggested. "Joint training programs where experienced mechanics learn new technologies while engineers learn practical implementation skills." "That could work," Sarah said thoughtfully, "but it would require careful curriculum development, appropriate facilities, and instructors who understand both worlds. It would also require buy-in from participants who might be skeptical about learning from people they see as less educated or less experienced," Marcus added. "Pride can be a significant barrier to learning." Sarah laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. "I've seen PhD engineers refuse to listen to technicians with 20 years of field experience because they didn't have advanced degrees. Ego often gets in the way of effective problem solving." Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, her professional demeanor immediately softening when she saw Marcus and Sarah engaged in animated technical discussion. "How's the tour going?" "Productively," Sarah replied. "Marcus has already identified several improvements we can make to the hybrid retrofit system, and we've been discussing training program possibilities." "Excellent," Victoria said with genuine satisfaction. "Marcus, what do you think of our facilities?" "Impressive," Marcus said honestly. "More practical and less theoretical than I expected. Your people seem to understand that good ideas only matter if they can be implemented effectively." "That's Sarah's influence," Victoria acknowledged. "She's been pushing us to focus on real-world applications rather than laboratory perfection." "Speaking of which," Sarah interjected, "I'd like to propose a pilot program. We select one of our retrofit projects and work with Rodriguez Auto Repair to develop installation procedures that actual mechanics can follow. Use the collaboration to test both the technology and the training concepts Marcus has been describing." Victoria looked intrigued by the suggestion. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" 6 months for initial development, 6 months for field testing," Sarah replied. "If it works, we can scale the program to include other vendors and expand the training curriculum." Marcus found himself caught up in the enthusiasm of their planning, but he also recognized the need for realistic expectations. That assumes Rodriguez Auto Repair can commit the resources for a year-long development project. We'd need to maintain our regular business while dedicating time to experimental work. Sterling Petroleum would compensate you for development time," Victoria said immediately. "This wouldn't be volunteer work disguised as partnership opportunity. And we'd provide technical support, equipment access, whatever you need to make the collaboration successful," Sarah added. The offer was tempting, but Marcus had learned to be cautious about commitments that sounded too good to be true. "I'd need to discuss this with Carlos and the rest of the team. A project like this would affect everyone at the shop, not just me." "Of course," Victoria agreed. "Take all the time you need to evaluate the opportunity, As they prepared to conclude the facility tour, Sarah handed Marcus a folder containing technical specifications for several of Sterling Petroleum's development projects. Background reading, she explained. If you decide to move forward with the collaboration, these will give you a better understanding of what we're working on. The drive back to Rodriguez Auto Repair gave Marcus time to process what he'd seen and heard at the research facility. Sterling Petroleum's technical capabilities were impressive, their commitment to innovation appeared genuine, and Sarah Chen seemed like someone who would be an effective partner for practical development work. But Marcus also recognized that corporate enthusiasm could fade quickly when projects encountered obstacles or failed to produce immediate results. The automotive industry was littered with promising partnerships that had collapsed under pressure from changing priorities or unrealistic expectations. Carlos was waiting in the shop office when Marcus returned, his expression eager and slightly anxious. "Well, what did you think of their operation?" "Professional," Marcus said, settling into the familiar comfort of his workplace. "More practical than I expected, less corporate than I feared. They're working on legitimate innovations, not just repackaging existing technology for marketing purposes." And the partnership opportunity. Marcus described his conversations with Sarah Chen, the proposed pilot program, and the potential for long-term collaboration on training initiatives. Carlos listened with growing excitement, occasionally interrupting with questions about technical details or financial arrangements. "This could be exactly what we need," Carlos said when Marcus finished his summary. "Steady income from the fleet maintenance contract, development fees for the pilot program, and positioning ourselves at the forefront of industry changes." "Maybe," Marcus agreed cautiously. "But Carlos, we need to be realistic about what this would require. Development work is unpredictable, deadlines can be impossible to meet, and corporate partners can lose interest quickly when projects don't go according to plan. So we protect ourselves with careful contracts and realistic timelines," Carlos replied pragmatically. "Marcus, opportunities like this don't come along often. We can't let fear of potential problems prevent us from pursuing genuine possibilities." The afternoon was spent in detailed discussions with the entire Rodriguez Auto Repair team, explaining the Sterling Petroleum opportunity and soliciting input from mechanics who would be directly affected by any partnership decisions. The responses were mixed, ranging from enthusiastic support to cautious skepticism. Miguel Santos, the shop's most experienced technician, raised concerns about maintaining quality standards while working on experimental projects. "We've built our reputation on reliable service," he pointed out. "If we're spending time on development work that doesn't pan out, it could affect our regular customers. That's why the pilot program would be carefully structured," Marcus explained. "Sterling Petroleum would compensate us for development time, so we wouldn't have to choose between experimental work and paying customers." "And what happens when the pilot program ends?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the shop's newest hire and only female mechanic. "Do we go back to routine maintenance, or do we become dependent on Sterling Petroleum for our business?" The question highlighted Marcus's deepest concern about the partnership opportunity. Rodriguez Auto Repair had survived by maintaining independence, by avoiding commitments that could leave them vulnerable to decisions made by people who didn't understand their business. "We maintain our core operations regardless of what happens with Sterling Petroleum," Marcus said firmly. "The partnership enhances what we do, but it doesn't replace our fundamental business model." The team meeting continued for another hour, covering practical concerns about workspace modifications, equipment needs, and the potential impact on shop culture. By the time they concluded, Marcus had a clearer understanding of both the opportunities and challenges the partnership would present. That evening, Marcus found himself in his workshop again, working on the hybrid Honda, while thinking through the implications of Sterling Petroleum's offer. The project had become a meditation for him, a way to process complex problems while keeping his hands busy with familiar tasks. Danny appeared in the doorway around 8 o'clock, having finished his homework and apparently sensing that his father needed company. "How's the car coming?" he asked, settling onto a stool near the workbench. "Slowly," Marcus replied, grateful for the interruption. "Sometimes the hardest problems take the longest to solve, like the lady from the fancy building." Danny asked with the perceptiveness that continually surprised Marcus. "What do you know about that?" "I heard you talking to Uncle Carlos about contracts and partnerships," Danny said, using the honorary title he'd given to Marcus's boss. "And you've been thinking really hard about something all week." Marcus paused in his work, recognizing that his 8-year-old son was asking for information he had a right to receive. Danny's life would be affected by whatever decision Marcus made about Sterling Petroleum, and pretending otherwise would be both dishonest and unfair. There's a company that wants to work with our shop, Marcus explained carefully. It could mean more money and interesting projects, but it would also mean changes to how we do things. Good changes or scary changes? Danny asked, echoing their familiar framework for evaluating new situations. I'm not sure yet, Marcus admitted. Maybe both. Danny nodded with the seriousness of a child who'd learned that adult decisions often involved complicated trade-offs. Are you going to say yes? I haven't decided, Marcus replied honestly. It's a big decision that would affect not just us, but everyone at the shop. I want to make sure I understand all the implications before I commit to anything. But you like the lady now? Danny pressed, having apparently picked up on the shift in Marcus's attitude toward Victoria. I respect her, Marcus said carefully. She's been more honest lately, and she seems genuinely interested in doing business the right way. That's good, Danny said approvingly. Mom always said you should work with people who make you want to be better at your job. The reference to Elena hit Marcus with unexpected force, not because it was painful but because it was so perfectly applicable to his current situation. His wife had possessed an intuitive understanding of character that had guided many of their important decisions, and her wisdom felt particularly relevant now. Your mom was smart about people, Marcus agreed. She would have had good advice about this situation. She would have told you to trust your gut, Danny said with confidence. That's what she always said when you were worried about something. Marcus smiled at his son's certainty, recognizing Elena's influence and Danny's straightforward approach to complex problems. And what does my gut tell me? I don't know, Danny replied seriously, but I think you should find out. The next morning brought unexpected clarity in the form of a phone call from Victoria, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately captured Marcus's attention. We have a situation, she said without preamble. One of our contractors' vehicles broke down at a drilling site, and they need specialized repair work that our usual vendors can't handle. What kind of vehicle? Marcus asked, already reaching for his tool bag. Modified drilling support truck, hybrid diesel-electric system, about 3 hours north of the city, Victoria explained. The contractor says it's a critical component failure that could shut down operations for days if we can't get it fixed quickly. Marcus understood the implication immediately. This wasn't just a repair job, it was a test of Rodriguez Auto Repair's capabilities under pressure, an opportunity to demonstrate their value to Sterling Petroleum in real-world conditions. I can be there in 4 hours, Marcus said, making rapid mental calculations about tools, parts and logistics. But I'll need detailed technical specifications and direct contact with whoever's been maintaining the vehicle. Already arranged, Victoria replied. Sarah Chen is coordinating technical support, and we'll have a helicopter standing by if you need specialized parts or additional equipment. The commitment of resources surprised Marcus, suggesting that this repair job was more important to Sterling Petroleum than routine contractor support would typically warrant. Victoria, what aren't you telling me about this situation? The drilling site is part of a demonstration project for our new environmental remediation technology, Victoria admitted after a brief pause. Federal regulators and environmental groups are monitoring every aspect of the operation. If equipment failures delay the project or suggest that our new systems aren't reliable, it could jeopardize approval for similar projects across the country. The stakes were much higher than Marcus had initially understood, involving not just Sterling Petroleum's reputation but the broader future of environmental cleanup technology. The pressure was significant, but so was the opportunity to prove that Rodriguez Auto Repair could handle critical assignments under demanding conditions. I'll need one of my best technicians, Marcus said, already planning the repair approach. And I want direct communication with your engineering team throughout the process, whatever you need, Victoria assured him. Marcus, I know this is short notice and high pressure, but if you can solve this problem, it will demonstrate exactly the kind of partnership value we've been discussing. An hour later, Marcus and Miguel Santos were driving north toward the drilling site, their truck loaded with diagnostic equipment and a comprehensive selection of parts that might be needed for hybrid system repairs. Miguel had volunteered for the assignment with enthusiasm, seeing it as an opportunity to work with cutting-edge technology while representing Rodriguez Auto Repair's capabilities. "No pressure," Miguel said with a grin as they navigated rural highways toward their destination. "Just the future of the company riding on whether we can fix some truck we've never seen before." "Just another day at the office," Marcus replied, though he shared his colleagues' mixture of excitement and apprehension about the challenge they were facing. The drilling site occupied a former industrial area that had been contaminated by decades of chemical processing, its restoration representing one of Sterling Petroleum's most ambitious environmental projects. The scale of the operation impressed Marcus, with specialized equipment and monitoring systems creating a complex technological landscape dedicated to undoing previous environmental damage. The disabled vehicle sat in the center of the work area, a massive truck equipped with both conventional diesel engines and electric drive systems that allowed it to operate without producing emissions in sensitive areas. The hybrid configuration was more sophisticated than anything Marcus had worked on, but the fundamental principles remained familiar. "Tell me what happened," Marcus said to the site foreman, a weathered man who looked skeptical about the capabilities of the two mechanics who'd been sent to solve his problem. "Started losing power about 6 hours ago," the foreman explained. "Electric system would engage intermittently, then shut down completely. Now we can't get more than half power from the diesel engine either." Marcus and Miguel spent the next 30 minutes conducting a systematic diagnostic evaluation, using both traditional troubleshooting methods and the advanced scanning equipment Sarah Chen had provided. The problem revealed itself gradually, a cascade of failures triggered by a faulty sensor that had caused the vehicle's computer systems to mismanage power distribution between electric and diesel components. "Good news and bad news," Marcus reported to Victoria during a status call. "Good news is we found the problem, and it's fixable. Bad news is it's going to take about 8 hours of work to replace the failed components and recalibrate the integrated systems." "Do it," Victoria said immediately. "Whatever resources you need, whatever it takes." The repair work required every bit of Marcus and Miguel's combined expertise, complicated by the need to maintain the vehicle's sophisticated emissions monitoring systems while replacing critical components. Sarah Chen provided remote technical support, walking them through calibration procedures that hadn't been documented in any service manual. As evening approached, the drilling site took on an almost surreal quality, with floodlights illuminating the work area, while Marcus and Miguel made final adjustments to the repaired hybrid system. The pressure was intense, but Marcus found himself energized by the challenge, reminded of why he'd chosen automotive work in the first place. "Power systems online," Miguel announced as the vehicle's diagnostic displays showed normal operation across all monitored parameters. "Looks like we did it." The test drive confirmed their success, with the hybrid truck operating smoothly across its full range of power modes. The site foreman's skepticism evaporated as he watched the massive vehicle respond precisely to control inputs, its emission systems functioning perfectly, while delivering the performance the drilling operation required. "Outstanding work," Victoria said when Marcus called to report the successful repair. "You've solved a problem that could have cost us weeks of delays and potentially jeopardized the entire remediation project." "That's what we do," Marcus replied, though privately he was impressed by his team's ability to adapt quickly to unfamiliar technology under extreme pressure. The drive back to the city gave Marcus and Miguel time to debrief their experience, discussing both the technical challenges they'd overcome and the broader implications for Rodriguez Auto Repair's relationship with Sterling Petroleum. "That was the most sophisticated system I've ever worked on," Miguel said as they navigated through late-night traffic. "But once we understood the underlying principles, it wasn't that different from any other hybrid configuration."
That's the key insight. Marcus agreed. New technology often builds on familiar foundations. The challenge is recognizing the connections and adapting existing skills to new applications. "So we take the Sterling Petroleum contract?" Miguel asked directly. Marcus considered the question as they approached the familiar neighborhood surrounding Rodriguez Auto Repair. The emergency repair had demonstrated that his team could handle Sterling Petroleum's most demanding technical challenges.
But it had also revealed the intense pressure that came with corporate partnerships where millions of dollars and regulatory approval hung in the balance. "We take it," Marcus said finally, recognizing that the decision felt right in ways that went beyond financial calculations or career advancement. "But we do it on our terms, with clear boundaries and realistic expectations about what we can and can't accomplish." "Good," Miguel said with satisfaction. "Because I want to work on more systems like that truck. The technology is fascinating, and Sterling Petroleum seems committed to solving real problems rather than just making money." The next morning would bring contract negotiations, detailed planning sessions, and the beginning of a partnership that would transform Rodriguez Auto Repair from a neighborhood garage into a key player in the automotive industry's technological evolution. But for now, Marcus was content to drive through the quiet streets of his city, confident that he'd made the right choice for his family, his employees, and his community. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that couldn't be anticipated and opportunities that hadn't yet been imagined. But Marcus had learned to trust his ability to adapt, to find solutions when problems seemed impossible, and to maintain his principles even under pressure. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same combination of technical skill, honest commitment, and community support that had carried him through every crisis so far. 6 months later, the Rodriguez Auto Repair Training Center occupied a renovated warehouse 3 blocks from the original shop, its spacious bays equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment alongside traditional automotive tools. Marcus stood in the main instruction area, watching as veteran mechanic Frank Martinez guided a group of Sterling Petroleum engineers through the process of diagnosing transmission problems using methods that had been refined through decades of practical experience. "The computer will tell you what's wrong," Frank was saying, his weathered hands moving confidently over the diagnostic display. "But understanding why it's wrong requires listening to the engine, feeling the vibrations, paying attention to details that don't show up on any screen." The engineers, all with advanced degrees and impressive technical credentials, leaned forward with genuine fascination as Frank demonstrated troubleshooting techniques that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and hands-on problem-solving. The scene represented everything Marcus had hoped to achieve when he'd first envisioned bringing different worlds together through shared learning. "How's the program going?" Victoria asked, appearing beside him with the quiet approach she'd developed over months of visiting the training center. "Better than I expected," Marcus replied honestly. "We're getting mechanics who want to understand new technology and engineers who want to understand practical implementation. Both groups are learning that their knowledge is incomplete without the other perspective." The pilot program with Sterling Petroleum had exceeded all expectations, leading to a formal partnership that now included fleet maintenance contracts, collaborative research projects, and the training center that had become Marcus's proudest achievement. Rodriguez Auto Repair had grown from a neighborhood garage to a recognized leader in automotive innovation, but the expansion had been managed carefully to preserve the community focus that had always defined their work. "Chen wants to discuss expanding the curriculum to include renewable energy systems," Victoria continued. "Solar, wind, battery storage, the full range of technologies that automotive mechanics might encounter as the industry evolves." Marcus nodded approvingly. Sarah Chen had become one of his closest collaborators, her practical approach to research and development meshing perfectly with his commitment to real-world applications. Together, they had developed training modules that were being adopted by technical schools across the region. "That makes sense," Marcus agreed. "The lines between automotive technology and energy management are blurring. Mechanics who understand both areas will have significant advantages in the job market." The training session concluded with participants from both groups working together on a complex diagnostic challenge, their different perspectives combining to identify problems that neither could have solved alone. Marcus watched with satisfaction as engineers and mechanics exchanged contact information, planning to continue their collaborations beyond the formal program. "Danny's science fair project is next week," Marcus mentioned as they walked toward his office, a space that still felt slightly surreal with its view of the busy training floor and walls covered with certificates of partnership and achievement. "How's he doing with the solar car design?" Victoria asked, her interest in Danny's education having developed naturally over the months of their professional relationship. Frustrated but determined, Marcus replied with a smile. He wants to build something that actually works, not just looks impressive for judges. Elena would have been proud of his approach to problem solving. The mention of his late wife had become easier over time, particularly in conversations with Victoria, who had learned to appreciate Elena's continued influence on both Marcus and Danny without trying to compete with or replace her memory. The relationship between Marcus and Victoria had evolved gradually from professional respect to genuine friendship, built on shared challenges and mutual understanding rather than romantic attraction. "I'd like to attend the science fair," Victoria said. "If that would be appropriate." "Danny would love that," Marcus assured her. "He's been working on the project with Miguel's son Carlos Jr., and both boys are excited about having real engineers evaluate their work." The friendship between their children had developed naturally through family gatherings that combined business discussions with community celebrations. Danny had found in Victoria someone who understood his growing interest in technical subjects, while Victoria had discovered in Danny the kind of honest curiosity that reminded her why innovation mattered beyond corporate profit margins. "Speaking of family," Victoria said with a slight smile, "I have something to tell you." Marcus looked at her with curiosity, recognizing the tone that usually preceded important announcements. "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," Victoria replied. "I've been offered a position with the Department of Energy, heading up a new initiative for public-private partnerships in clean technology development. It would mean leaving Sterling Petroleum and moving to Washington." The news hit Marcus harder than he'd expected, not romantically but professionally and personally. Victoria had become an integral part of the success Rodriguez Auto Repair had achieved, and more importantly, she'd become a trusted friend whose perspective he valued on both business and personal matters. "When would this start?" Marcus asked, already beginning to calculate the implications for their various collaborative projects. 6 months, Victoria said. "Enough time to ensure all our partnerships are properly transitioned and sustainable without my direct involvement." "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked, focusing on her needs rather than his concerns about the change. Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the training floor where engineers and mechanics continued to work together on problems that had seemed impossible to solve just a year earlier. "I want to take the position," she said finally. "It's an opportunity to influence policy at a national level, to create programs that could replicate what we've built here in communities across the country." "Then you should take it," Marcus said immediately, recognizing the importance of the opportunity despite his personal reluctance to see her leave. "The partnerships we've established will continue," Victoria assured him. "Sarah Chen is being promoted to head the Community Development Division, and she's completely committed to expanding the programs we've started. If anything, having someone in Washington who understands the practical value of what you're doing here could be beneficial for long-term funding and policy support." Marcus understood the logic of her argument, but he also recognized that change always carried risks no matter how carefully managed. "What about Danny? You've become important to him." "Victoria, how do I explain that you're leaving?" "The same way you've explained every other major change in his life," Victoria replied gently. Honestly, with confidence that he can handle the truth, and with assurance that important relationships don't end just because circumstances change. The conversation was interrupted by Danny's arrival at the training center, his school day having ended with his usual burst of energy and questions about whatever project was currently occupying his father's attention. He greeted Victoria with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become a regular part of his extended family. "Dad, Miguel says you're working on a new hybrid system that can switch between 5 different power sources," Danny announced, his excitement evident in the rapid-fire delivery that indicated a particularly interesting discovery. 6 different sources, Marcus corrected with a smile. "Solar, wind, battery, diesel, natural gas and regenerative braking. The challenge is coordinating all the systems so they work together efficiently." "Can I help?" Danny asked hopefully, having developed enough technical knowledge to contribute meaningfully to some of the simpler projects. After homework, Marcus replied automatically, the familiar negotiation that had become part of their daily routine. Danny accepted this condition with good humor, settling at a workbench to tackle his assignments while remaining close enough to overhear the adult conversations that increasingly interested him. His presence changed the dynamic between Marcus and Victoria, reminding them both that their professional relationship existed within the broader context of family and community responsibilities. "Have you told Sarah about the Washington opportunity?" Marcus asked as they reviewed progress reports from the various training programs. "This morning," Victoria confirmed. "She's excited about the possibilities for expansion and thinks the federal position could help secure long-term funding for community-based technical education programs. And the Sterling Petroleum Board, supportive," Victoria said with some surprise. "They see it as positive visibility for the company's community investment initiatives. Having a former Sterling executive in a high-level government position could benefit their regulatory relationships." The practical considerations were falling into place, but Marcus found himself concerned about the personal implications of Victoria's departure. Their friendship had provided stability and perspective during a period of significant professional growth, and he wasn't sure how to replace the kind of honest feedback and collaborative support she'd offered. "I'm going to miss working with you," Marcus said directly, choosing honesty over professional politeness. "I'm going to miss it too," Victoria admitted. "But Marcus, what we've built here isn't dependent on my presence. The training center, the research partnerships, the community connections, all of that exists because you had the vision to see how different kinds of knowledge could work together. We built it together," Marcus corrected. "Your resources and connections made it possible, but more importantly, your willingness to challenge your own assumptions about how business relationships should work created space for something genuinely innovative." The months of collaboration had transformed both of them in ways that went beyond professional development. Marcus had gained confidence in his ability to operate in corporate environments without compromising his principles, while Victoria had learned to value practical wisdom alongside academic credentials and to measure success in terms of community impact rather than just financial returns. "There's something else," Victoria said as the training center began to quiet down for the evening. "The Washington position comes with discretionary funding for pilot projects in community development. I want to propose expanding the Rodriguez model to other cities, creating a network of training centers that connect local automotive businesses with clean technology initiatives." The scope of what she was suggesting took Marcus's breath away. The concept they'd developed through trial and error in a single city could become a template for economic development and workforce training across the country, bridging the gap between traditional industries and emerging technologies on a scale that could influence national policy. "That would require significant coordination," Marcus said slowly, his mind already working through the practical challenges of replicating their success in different communities with different needs and resources. "It would," Victoria agreed. "But it would also create opportunities for mechanics and engineers in dozens of cities to access the kind of training and collaboration that's transformed your business here. And it would require someone in Washington who understands how these partnerships actually work," Marcus realized, suddenly grasping the full implications of Victoria's career move. "Exactly," Victoria confirmed with a smile. "Sometimes the best way to preserve and expand something you care about is to position yourself where you can influence the policies and funding that determine its future." Danny looked up from his homework at the sound of their animated discussion, his expression curious about the excitement he heard in their voices. "Are you planning something new?" he asked with the directness that still occasionally caught adults off guard. "Victoria's going to take a job in Washington that could help create training centers like ours in other cities," Marcus explained, automatically including his son in conversations about plans that would affect their family. "That's cool," Danny said approvingly. "But will you still come to my science fair?" "I wouldn't miss it," Victoria assured him. "And Danny, wherever I am, you can always call me if you have questions about your projects or if you want to tell me about your latest discoveries." The promise seemed to satisfy Danny, who returned to his homework with the confidence of a child who'd learned that important adults in his life could be trusted to keep their commitments even when circumstances changed. The science fair the following week showcased the kind of innovation and collaboration that had become characteristic of the community surrounding Rodriguez Auto Repair. Danny and Carlos Jr. presented their solar car, alongside projects from other children whose parents worked in various aspects of the clean technology sector, creating a display that demonstrated how technical education could inspire the next generation of problem solvers. Victoria attended as promised, joining a crowd that included Sterling Petroleum engineers, local mechanics, community college instructors and families from throughout the neighborhood. The event felt like a celebration of everything their partnership had accomplished, proof that different worlds could not only coexist but could create something better together. First place in the engineering category, Danny announced proudly as he showed off the ribbon his solar car had earned. The judges said our power management system was the most innovative they'd seen from elementary students. Your mother would have been so proud, Marcus said, his arm around his son's shoulders as they admired the award. I think she knows, Danny replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance of loss that had developed over the past 2 years. Victoria says Mom's engineering skills live on in the things I build and the way I think about problems. The comment revealed the depth of the relationship Victoria had developed with Danny, her ability to honor Elena's memory while encouraging his continued growth and development. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for the unexpected gifts their professional partnership had brought to his family. As the science fair concluded and families began to pack up their displays, Victoria pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. I start in Washington next month, she said, but I want you to know that leaving here feels like leaving family. You'll always be family, Marcus replied simply. Geography doesn't change that. There's one more thing, Victoria said, her expression shifting to something more formal. Sterling Petroleum wants to establish an annual award for community-based technical innovation, recognizing programs that bridge traditional skills with emerging technologies. They want to name it after Rodriguez Auto Repair. The honor was unexpected and deeply meaningful, representing recognition not just of their technical achievements but of their approach to community development and workforce training. I'm honored, Marcus said, but I'd prefer it be named after the partnership itself, acknowledging that innovation requires collaboration between different perspectives and resources. The Sterling Rodriguez Innovation Award, Victoria suggested with a smile. Perfect, Marcus agreed. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same training center watching a new group of participants work through diagnostic challenges that had become standard curriculum for the expanded program. Sarah Chen had proven to be an even more effective administrator than Victoria, bringing scientific rigor to program evaluation while maintaining the practical focus that made the training relevant to real-world applications. His phone rang with Victoria's familiar number, their weekly check-ins having become a valued constant despite the distance between them. How's Washington treating you? Marcus asked as he stepped into his office for privacy. Bureaucratically, Victoria replied with a laugh. But I'm making progress on the funding proposal for expanding the training center model. I think we'll have approval for pilot programs in 5 cities by the end of the year. That's fantastic news, Marcus said, genuinely excited about the possibilities for replicating their success in other communities. And Marcus, Victoria continued, I have personal news too. I'm seeing someone, a fellow policy wonk who actually understands why I get excited about workforce development programs. The announcement brought Marcus genuine happiness, recognizing that Victoria deserved the kind of personal fulfillment that had taken time to develop after years of focusing exclusively on professional achievement. That's wonderful, I'm happy for you. What about you? Victoria asked. Any romantic developments worth reporting? Marcus smiled at the question, appreciating her continued interest in his personal life. I'm focused on Danny and the business right now. Romance feels like a complication I don't need. Fair enough, Victoria said. But Marcus, don't let work become an excuse to avoid the possibility of finding someone who appreciates everything you bring to a relationship. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, covering business developments, Danny's latest achievements, and the small details of daily life that maintained their friendship across distance and changed circumstances. When they hung up, Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction that came from connections that transcended professional necessity to become genuine personal support. That evening, as he worked in his shop on a new hybrid prototype that incorporated lessons learned from months of collaboration with Sterling Petroleum's engineering team, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness during a rainstorm. Victoria's emergency had introduced complications and opportunities that had transformed not just his business but his understanding of what was possible when different worlds found ways to work together. Danny appeared in the workshop doorway, homework completed and permission requested to observe the evening's technical work. At 10 years old, he had developed genuine expertise in automotive systems and renewable energy technologies. his education enriched by exposure to innovations that most children his age would never encounter. "Dad," Danny said as he settled onto his usual stool, "do you think Mom would have liked Victoria?" The question surprised Marcus with its thoughtfulness and maturity. "I think your mom would have respected Victoria's intelligence and appreciated her commitment to doing work that matters." "Why do you ask?" "Because I was thinking about how different people can become important to us in different ways," Danny said with the philosophical perspective that occasionally emerged from his young mind. "Victoria's not trying to replace Mom, but she's become someone who cares about us and helps us do better things." "That's very wise," Marcus said, impressed once again by his son's emotional intelligence. "Some people come into our lives for specific purposes, and when they fulfilled those purposes, the relationships continue in new forms. Like how Victoria moved to Washington but we still talk to her, and she still helps with our projects." "Exactly like that," Marcus confirmed. "Important relationships adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential value." As they worked together on the hybrid system, father and son continued their conversation about relationships change, and the ways that unexpected encounters could reshape entire lives. The prototype took shape under their combined efforts, representing both technical innovation and the kind of collaborative problem-solving that had become their signature approach to challenges both mechanical and personal. 6 months later, the first of the expanded training centers opened in Detroit, with others scheduled for Cleveland, Phoenix, and Austin. Marcus traveled to each opening, sharing the lessons learned from their original program while adapting the model to local conditions and needs. The success exceeded everyone's expectations, creating job opportunities and technological advancement in communities that had struggled with economic transitions. Victoria's position in Washington had evolved to include oversight of a national initiative for workforce development in emerging technologies. Her success measured not in corporate profits but in the number of people whose lives were improved by access to training and employment opportunities that bridged traditional skills with future innovations. Danny, now 11 and increasingly sophisticated in his technical interests, had become something of a poster child for the educational possibilities that emerged when children were exposed early to collaborative problem-solving across different disciplines. His science fair projects had grown increasingly ambitious, reflecting both natural aptitude and the kind of mentoring that came from being surrounded by adults who were passionate about innovation and community development. Rodriguez Auto Repair had expanded beyond Marcus's wildest dreams while maintaining the community focus and commitment to quality that had always defined their work. The original shop continued to serve neighborhood customers with the same dedication and fair pricing that had built their reputation, while the training center and research partnerships opened new possibilities for both technical advancement and economic development. Standing in the original garage where Victoria Sterling had first appeared in his life as a frightened stranger in need of help, Marcus marveled at the unexpected directions that simple human kindness could create. The $5 he'd spent helping her to the hospital had generated returns that couldn't be measured in financial terms, creating opportunities and relationships that had enriched his life in ways he'd never imagined possible. The rain that night had washed away his assumptions about the barriers between different worlds, revealing possibilities for connection and collaboration that had transformed not just his business but his understanding of what community could mean. Sometimes the most important investments were the ones made without expecting any return, acts of generosity that created value in ways that couldn't be predicted or planned. As Marcus locked up the shop for the evening and headed home to help Danny with a project that would combine solar energy collection with automated mechanical systems, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, relationships that endured, and the knowledge that his choice to help a stranger in distress had created ripples of positive change that would continue long after he'd forgotten the details of that stormy night. The future remained unpredictable, filled with challenges that would require continued adaptation and innovation. But Marcus faced it with confidence built on experience, supported by a community that had grown stronger through diversity, and guided by principles that had proven their worth through testing in both crisis and success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.